Hey, Sean McElroy here with another one of our Autoline Exclusives. And joining me today from Italy is Matteo Fini, the Executive Director of Supply Chain and Technology at IHS Markit, which is a provider of global information. And Matteo, I want to thank you for joining me today.
Hi, Sean. Good to see you.
Yeah, thank you. You guys recently did a survey of automakers and suppliers to see how this whole COVID-19 thing is going to impact R&D projects and budgets and that sort of thing. We covered a little bit of that on our Autoline Daily program, but I want to dive into it a little bit deeper. So Matteo, my first question for you is, can you give us a scope of this survey and some of the things that really stuck out to you?
Sure. So we had 140 respondents among OEMs and suppliers responding to the survey, representing roughly 77 billion of research and development budget. So it's quite a big amount. So all the larger OEMs in North America, Europe, as well as China and Japan, as well as the larger suppliers. And we've been asking them to focus really on the size of the R&D budget cuts, so research and development budget cuts, looking also at, I will say, which technology areas are more likely to be impacted by COVID-19 and the disruption that ensues with the COVID-19. And also looking at the impact on the automotive startup environment, which obviously is a big deal. You know, there's about 1,400 companies in that automotive startup space, which of course are going to be impacted to a lesser or greater extent due to the economic disruption that comes with COVID-19. And finally, also, you know, focusing on the regulatory frameworks and how this will be impacted as a function of COVID-19, effectively resulting in regulators having to reassess some of those priorities. And yeah, I mean, in terms of, you know, the main findings, I would say, you know, I would probably focus more on, you know, what I found somewhat different than my expectations.
Yeah.
Starting with something to do with the extent to which these cuts can be done to research and development budgets versus revenues. So if you compare those two, we are clearly seeing that the OEMs as well as the suppliers cannot make those cuts as quickly as they would want to, and of course, you know, revenue is going to be impacted straight away due to the shutdown of plants, due to dealership closing. And so clearly this is going to have an impact on that profitability that the OEMs and suppliers will have to you know, try to achieve over the next few months and also in the next few years. Second thing I would say is the fact that the OEMs tend to be a bit more optimistic than suppliers. So suppliers telling us that they expect this to last over a year, while most OEMs think that this is going to be more of a matter of 3-6 months. So yeah, that's also some different level of sensitivity. And then finally, you know, one piece of statistic that I found particularly interesting is the fact that clearly we were expecting both OEMs and suppliers to tell us that some CO2/fuel economy regulation would have been diluted. But we had as much as 98% of respondents telling us that, which of course, you know, is a big number.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, you know, when you start talking about slashing of R&D budgets, for me at least, the first thing that pops to my head is what's going to happen with those vehicles that are already in development? Do you see them getting pushed back, or what happens to them?
Right. Yeah, I mean, generally speaking, it really depends the stage at which a certain vehicle is. So if we, I mean, without wanting to go into the full details of our product development plan,
right,
but generally speaking, think of it this way. You have a big phase that starts from minus 60 months from when the vehicle is actually launched, from job one, let's say. And so minus 60 months to minus 24 is essentially when the whole development of that vehicle happens. No? So when they're going to first define, which sort of vehicle they want to develop at a high level, styling, initial styling, then moving on to define that vehicle more from a technical and engineering standpoint, up to minus 24 months. Of course, each OEM is different, but minus 24 months is when they freeze the design. No? Now, if a vehicle is in that phase from minus 60 to minus 24, it's more likely to be cut, right? It's more likely that if that vehicle is perhaps one of the it's a vehicle in a passenger car segment, still at the early stage, or perhaps it was a halo vehicle that they didn't really need, it's more likely to be cut. Anything that tends to be from design freeze, so that from the famous minus 24 months that I was mentioning to you before, to job one, is more committed, because that investment has been put together, has been deployed, and there's obviously in that phase from minus 24 to job one, you have all of the sourcing activities, so allocating the business to suppliers, making sure that the manufacturing capacity is there, the tooling is there. So again, it's quite there's been already a certain level of capital deployment, and it's much more difficult to pull out of that.
You mentioned one of the things that kind of jumped out to you was that automakers are more optimistic than the suppliers are. Now, the whole world is experiencing COVID-19. Are some regions more concerned than others, or is this kind of, just an overall normal concern with everybody?
Yeah, I would say there is definitely more concern in Europe based on the results that we have seen in the survey. Now, you could argue, it's down to the fact that this region has been exposed to the impacts of COVID-19 perhaps for longer. And at the same time, perhaps you could argue that some of the respondents in this part of the world might feel that those lockdown measures, there's very little clarity still when this will be over, while perhaps in North America there are already discussions on moving out of this whole lockdown period. So I guess it's really down to where the industry is and the level of impact that this has had over here in Europe. Of course, this is not to say that North American or Asian market players are not concerned, but there's definitely a bias towards a more pessimistic European supply base as well as automaker base.
And you said some of the data from your findings suggested that automakers and suppliers are going to have to maintain a level of R&D spending despite there going to be a knock to their revenue. Right. With that in mind, how are they going to start cutting costs for R&D? Are we going to see more activities being brought in-house?
Right. Yeah, of course. I mean, it really depends on, it's on a case-by-case basis, I would say. So you have to consider a couple of things. First, there is an overall strategy that some car makers might pursue with regards to R&D activities around insourcing, outsourcing. So, for example, Volkswagen is notoriously more vertical integrated in component production, but also in R&D activities. So they tend to do much more of their R&D in-house, whilst, for example, General Motors tends to be much more reliant upon external parties for both the manufacturing and the R&D side. So that's so essentially the response will be different depending on the market player. But typically this would result in if they have very little wiggle room in terms of redundancies, which is the case with many European OEMs, for example, they will try to leverage their in-house resources. While, for example, for that North American footprint where there is a bit more flexibility on with redundancies and all of that, you will probably see that they will try to leverage, to an extent, some of those external partners on a project-by-project basis. But from what we are hearing, a lot of those external R&D projects are being reconsidered in light of COVID-19.
And you even mentioned some regulations possibly being pushed back. Can you talk about that a little bit more, please?
Yeah, sure. This is really down to the perception that the OEMs and suppliers have shared with us that the regulatory environment has to adapt to the new market conditions. So you're seeing market conditions that suggest that we're gonna go out of this level of the economic disruption not as quickly as perhaps one would have hoped. And it's obviously quite difficult to request to the OEMs and generally speaking to the whole industry to support some high level of R&D investment into electrification and autonomy at a time when there's going to be quite a significant pressure on the OEMs and supplier financials as a function of COVID-19 disruption. And so on that basis, you will see, for example, I will take the case in Europe where you have large fines that the OEMs might be facing due to CO2, the lack of CO2 compliance. It will be very hard, to justify in the current context that, a governmental authority might be requesting the payment of fines whilst the OEMs are struggling financially, right? So that will be difficult. And equally for other topics like autonomy or, ADAS features, it's very hard to see how you could justify to the final consumer that there is an increase in price of a vehicle because there's been a push from a regulatory standpoint of certain features that add up quite some cost into the vehicle. For example, there is a new regulation, UNECE, that is in the process of being adopted in Europe by mid-2022, and it's very similar to some of the regulation or the voluntary agreements that the OEMs have achieved in North America. And this adds up about €100 per vehicle by 2022. I mean, someone has to pay that €100, and either the cost is being absorbed by the OEMs or it's being passed on to the final consumer. And in this current environment, I think both OEMs and suppliers are wondering whether this is something that it can still be supported.
So if EVs and AVs are the things that are going to help us meet these future regulations, but now we're probably going to see some sort of delay in them, is there any one thing that's kind of driving the delay in these future technologies? Is it where they're at in the development process, or is it price to develop those technologies?
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. So I think you have to look at the size of the investments that have already been deployed and committed by the OEMs. To give you a couple of numbers, based on our assessment, we estimate about 300 billion going into electrification from all the major OEMs, and only, inverted commas, 100 billion going into AVs, right?
Okay.
So if you look at the size of these investments, this suggests that investment in electrification is further down the line. So even though it might not be, might not feel like an immediate priority, and particularly in some markets like North America, where you have had a dilution of CAFE regulation, you definitely you can see that this investment is being deployed, and therefore those vehicles will have to come out. Will come out perhaps with some delay, yes. But they will be coming out. On the other hand, for some feature, some vehicle feature that is somewhat more of a nice to have, for example, a level 3 autonomy, level 4 autonomy, and of course level 5 autonomy, where there's a whole business model question that is still out there and needs to be answered by the various market players. You can definitely see that there's going to be a slowdown. And what we have heard from respondents in the survey is that some levels of autonomy, particularly from level 3 and above, will be delayed because there's no tangible benefit to the OEMs. There's not a queue of customers out there wanting a level 3 car, and in that context, this is more likely to be impacted.
Well, it's a bummer to hear delays about some of that stuff, especially in the forms of safety. I'm wondering, right, is there any good news in this? Is there something that we can end on a good note with?
I would say we still get a level of commitment to automotive R&D investment, and there were strong comments around the fact that there's going to be companies coming out of this stronger than entered, because of course there's going to be a level of market consolidation. So one thing that you can definitely expect here is the fact that there's going to be companies that will be probably pushed even more to aggregate and obviously to become stronger by joining forces, right? And definitely this is, if you look at it from a financial standpoint, this is the right thing to do for the industry, because I mean it's been a topic for many years, of how much capital has been burned in the automotive industry, how much suboptimal the profile, the profitability profile of the automotive industry has been. So if the positive thing, if we want to call it as positive, will be that there's going to be much more consolidation, and COVID-19 will push that even further.
Well, I got to tell you, very interesting to see how COVID-19 is going to impact R&D projects and budgets and all that. Matteo Fini from IHS Markit, we want to thank you for taking the time for joining us all the way from Italy today.
Thanks for having me. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.